You're listening to the Common Fan Podcast, a Husker football podcast for the common fan, by the common fan.
Welcome back to the Common Fan Podcast. I am TJ Burkle with Matty Owens Sr. and Geoff in Lincoln. This is episode 6 of The Reckoning. Special guest Brandon Vogel is joining us for all of the Reckoning episodes, and our featured guest today is Michael Severe. We've now looked at every coach and era of Nebraska football post Tom Osborne. We've had some thoroughly engaging and interesting discussions, from what would have happened if Nebraska hadn't fired Frank Solich, to whether Bill Callahan would have worked with more time, and on to similarly intriguing discussions about the Pelini, Riley, and Frost tenures. Make sure to check out those episodes if you haven't already, Common fans. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're at it. The topic we're exploring today is the promise of Matt Rhule. You know what else has a lot of promise, Common fans, is the mouth-watering steak you can find at Certified Piedmontese. They've also got juicy burgers, high-quality ribs, delicious roasts, and so much more. Raised and grazed in the beautiful Sandhills region of the state, Certified Piedmontese sets the standard for Nebraska beef. Get to your local Mercado Butcher Shop at 30th and Yankee Hill, or 84th and Havelock in Lincoln, and at 162nd and Maple in Omaha. You can also go to cpbeef.com to get Certified Piedmontese products shipped right to your front door anywhere across all 50 states. Certified Piedmontese, powering the Husker football team and powering the Common Fan Podcast. Michael and Brandon, hello guys. It's an honor to have you guys with us today.
What a professional segue that was. I see you riding your two-wheeler around, just like, I'm segueing. That was pretty good.
I appreciate that, Michael. Thank you so much.
Well
coming from a seasoned professional like yourself, that
Not
means
that
a
good.
lot.
Yeah.
Well, it's nice to have you back with us, Michael. Is everything going all right with you?
Oh yeah, everything's good. This is my favorite subject. B. Vogues will tell you I love talking analytics, and I love talking Nebraska's past, especially when we get into things like what could have happened. You know, I'm a big what if comic guy. I love comic books. What If was one of my favorites. I love watching the show. Love it. And this is What If Nebraska. You know, I'm all about it.
I love hearing that. That's what this entire series is all about. So we're excited to dive in with you. One reason I've always loved listening to you is because you're not from the state. You're probably one of the most objective guys out there when it comes to assessing Nebraska football. And you combine that with the fact that you're such a football guy and you really dive in, you watch film, you do the analytics, you understand the game so well. So that's why I've always really appreciated your perspective on Nebraska football, because it's probably the most objective out there. And I remember one of the things that stands out to me is right before the 2017 season. Can't remember what you were doing, that if you were doing the bottom line or if you were doing the morning back at 1620. But I remember, you know, whatever system you have that you plug numbers into, I think you had it at about 4-8 or 5-7 or something like that. And I was like, well, wait a second. The Manning said, Tanner Lee was so good. Like, what's going on here? What's going on with this? This can't, he's got to be wrong. Michael's got to be wrong.
I will never forget calling Charles Davis, who was at the Manning camp when Tanner Lee was there. Nick Mullins, by the way, MVP of that camp. Remember calling him and saying, what'd you think about Tanner Lee? Because I know Tanner Lee from Jesuit High School in New Orleans. I know a lot about him. I call people. I knew about him at Tulane. So I asked him about it, and he's like, I don't know. That's all he said. And I was like, oh, because Charles likes everybody. And I was like, uh-oh, I don't know about this. And so that was one of the first things I remember thinking to myself, oh, this might not go well if Charles Davis doesn't like it.
Yeah. Well, let's jump right in. The goal of this episode is to kind of put a bow on all these conversations about the past that we've had. And Michael, I think you're the perfect guy to help us do that. And then we're going to pivot and we're going to look forward to the Matt Rhule era and the hope and promise that come with that. But let's jump right in here, and kind of a big picture question to start for you, Michael. I mean, there's so many factors at play about what's gone wrong for Nebraska football in the last 25 years, and so many different characters in this in this show, right?
Mhm.
If you had to boil it down to like one thing or one small handful of things,
Yeah.
or maybe like one thing that if they had done it differently, or a couple things if they had maybe managed it differently, things wouldn't have gotten so bad for Husker football, what would that be?
B. Vogues knows it's minus 111, right? Since 20
Turnovers.
years ago, minus 111 turnover margin. That number doesn't even feel like it's possibly right. I've gone through them before. I remember Dirk and I had talked about it. This might have been in like maybe 4 or 5 years ago when he was writing a column for the World Herald. And we were going through it and we're like talking, we're like, these numbers can't be right. But every time you finish adding them up, they came out to the same thing. Nebraska is as bad as any team in the history of college football in terms of turnover margin. They played in 20 years, they played 261 games. I went through this and looked at it to see, just basically what kind of percentage wise, like how many times are they going to be a team that is negative in terms of their turnover margin per game? And this team sets all kind of records for it, whether it be breaking even twice in these last 20 years or being positive margin only twice these last 20 years. It comes down to every game. And John Bishop does a great job of tracking this every year. He goes through it. How many times when they've been positive, they've won games, how many when they've been even, they've won games, and how many times they've lost when they've been negative. It's easy. It's the turnovers. It's finishing in the bottom 20 or 25 or 30. So the bottom, depending on when it changed, we had 128 teams, 131 teams. They did that 9 times in those 20 years. Almost half the time they finished in the bottom 20 in turnover margin. That's it. I mean, you fix 2-3 turnovers a season, and all of a sudden you're talking about making a bowl game or a bowl game to winning a conference title to winning whatever. It's that simple. They turn the ball over too damn much, and it's multiple coaching staffs. It's multiple quarterbacks. It's a disease. I asked Coach Rhule about it. It's exactly how I phrased it when we interviewed him last year before Big Red Wrap Up. I said to him, it's going, of course, it's an epidemic. It's going through multiple coaching staffs. What can you do to fix it? And he gave me a list of things. Didn't work. So that's it. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I was hoping you were going to blame Harvey Perlman, but but I mean, how does that's 5 head coaches ago.
Yeah,
that goes back 5 head coaches. That's insane. Yeah. Brandon, anything to add to that?
Good.
Go ahead, Michael. Go ahead, Michael.
I was going to say 2016 is the great example, right? The year they didn't have the fumbling quarterback and they just had the interception-prone quarterback, they got to a bowl game. So, I mean, it shows you that when they cleared that up for 1 year, it was profitable with a weak schedule still, but it was profitable. It just shows you what it means, the differences.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it defies all explanation. I mean, from a numbers perspective, I tend to view turnovers as pretty random. Yep. But Nebraska, it hasn't been, and that's the difference. And I mean, you think back to the option era years, like those are offenses that turned the ball over quite a bit just by the nature of the offense they ran. The defense was good enough that, like, I don't remember off the top of my head what it was in like 1995, their turnover margin, but they obviously came out on the winning end of it. So it's truly, truly bizarre in terms of on-field things. When you look at a big picture, like it's almost tough to select anything else. And why has Nebraska been what it's been? It's that you can't be minus 111.
He brought up something interesting. I talked to this with Damon. I talked to this with Tommy Frazier and stuff. So those fumbles, the majority of the time, right, they were in front of you. They were offensive linemen. Everybody could see it. They got it. A lot of the fumbles that happen now and the turnovers that happen now are quarterbacks losing the ball and they're behind the play. And so the defense is back there. They've got the advantage. So opposed to fumbling and turning it over in front of you, opposed to behind you, is why a lot of those fumbles, I believe they led the nation in 94 in fumbles, I think, but they recovered a ton of them. It's because of the way the fumbles and where they happen.
Yep.
Interesting.
Crazy. Well, it's hard to win any games, no matter who the coach is, when you're turning over that much. But I'm curious, Michael, I think maybe we've had 4 coaching searches since Tom Osborne. I think I'm leaving out Frank Solich. There really wasn't a search there. He was the handpicked successor. Right. But during that time, were there any coaches out there that might have been available or even just open to the Nebraska job where you said, oh my gosh, Nebraska needs to go and get that guy?
If you've done a radio show in the last 25 years in this market, You have that list they always talk about the AD has in their desk. You have a list too, right? You always have that list to go to. And for me, for a number of years, I thought it was Dan Mullen. I really did. I liked Dan Mullen a couple different times. Dan Mullen did more with less at Mississippi State than really almost any coach in the country. If you watch what he did, the amount of games he won at a place, it's hard to win, hard to recruit, and he did that and he won. So a couple times Dan Mullen was on my list. I'm a Willie Fritz guy. Willie was coaching at Sam Houston State. I'm a Sam Houston State grad. He left there, Georgia Southern, whether it's there or Tulane. I always loved what Willie runs offensively. I thought it could fit at Nebraska, specifically 2017. I really thought Willie should have been considered for that job at the time. He was at Tulane. It was early on there, but I thought so. But the biggest one, I think, would be now you got to change some things. You got to keep Frank Solich for 2004. You keep him for 2004. And I think many of us thought that season wasn't going to go great anyway, right? Even if you kept him. So you keep him. Then the firing of Frank Solich is much more accepted because he has a bad season. And of course you hire Urban Meyer from Utah. And then everything's fixed. But you got to have patience as Steve Peterson did not have. They hire these new coaches, new assistants. They give them 2-year contracts. That could have been the reason why he said, I'm not going to fire Frank Solich. Despite some bad losses in 2003, we have these coaches for another year. The defense was much better. The recruiting starting to get a little bit better. Let's just stay with it for one more year and we see what happens. Let 2004 fail, go 6-6 or whatever else. Then you fire him. Not everybody's pissed off. And the next thing you do is you go out and you hire a hot coach like Urban Meyer. So instead of going to Florida, he goes to Nebraska.
Yeah. And he probably would. I mean, it was much more attractive job at that time than it would have been, in the last, 7-8 years.
Oh, sure.
What about you, Brandon? Any coaches over the last 20 or so years that you would have thought that guy would be a great fit at Nebraska?
Yeah, so as I was doing research for each of the individual episodes, I actually put this in my notebook for each one. Hindsight Heroes is how I titled it for myself. And Urban Meyer, I think, is probably number one. Like, even if you don't hang on to Solich for 2004, which I think Michael's right, this was probably the savvy play. You would have had to be 1 year ahead of Florida to get him. And I think he went 10-2 at Utah his first year. Like, that was just his third year, but so you would have had to been early. And I think there were a lot of these where you can see some guys, because I looked at like who else was getting hired around this time, and it's like, it's tough. Like Mark D'Antonio just got the Cincinnati job in 2004. Like, you're not getting the Nebraska job. Brian Kelly had just come up from D3 at Central Michigan. You're not getting him. So I think Meyer is probably the closest, like, sliding doors type of moment. I don't know how realistic it was with Riley, but he came up during our episode on that one. Whittingham. I've long thought Whittingham's long been at the top of my list over the past couple of changes, at least, where I'm like, he's just playing Big Ten football out there. Like, and it would really, really work. I talked to a former Utah player when it looked like we were nearing the end of Frost, and I was like, what's the deal with Whittingham? He's like, he's at Utah now. He's like, that's just what it is. So those were kind of the only two that jumped out. Mullen around the Pelini era. I mean, the Pelini era is interesting because, like, maybe we talk about this a little bit. Like, it kind of worked out. Art Briles was hired at Baylor, which is a problem now, but Baylor in the Big 12 prior to that point was just like the team like you didn't even consider, at least for myself. It was like, well, that's just a win. And he obviously took Baylor to pretty great heights. David Cutcliffe at Duke. Nah, I mean, I like David Cutcliffe, but that's not going to work in Nebraska, I don't think so. Oh, and Chip Kelly. Like, if you wanted to be really adventurous instead of Pelini and you're ready to pluck Chip Kelly away from Oregon as an OC, like, even if you could, that's the other one. But there's really not a lot, I think, is the big story. There's none where it's just like, well, obviously that's where you go. Meyer is the closest.
Yeah. Everybody know the ultimate one, though, and this goes back a little bit farther, but it's hiring Bob Stoops. After Osborne steps down, you don't keep the guy around. You move on to another coach, and Bob Stoops is sitting there as a defensive coordinator at Florida. And you nail him like 2 years before he goes to Oklahoma. So, I mean, that was one but they never had an open search. They have an open search if Osborne. So I think the biggest thing that would have had to happen would have been a change of athletic director a year or two earlier, then maybe that person has more sway over making a change opposed to keeping Frank Solich. But I think there was no way you were going to override a guy who just had the career that Osborne had. So get Solich.
Awesome. Good stuff.
TJ, all right, I'll hop in real quick. TJ, you joked about Harvey Perlman and wishing that Mike would have blamed him, but that kind of got my brain rolling there. We've had a lot of potential heroes in this long saga that we've gone through.
Flawed heroes.
Flawed heroes. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Much like Star Wars, flawed heroes.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people have made their decisions for whatever reasons they've made their decisions, but any good story like this has to have a villain, right? Is there a villain in all of this? Like you could even argue that the turnovers are the villain, but is there a person or anybody that you can pinpoint here that would be a reason for Nebraska not being where they need to be?
So my youngest he's a freshman in high school going into sophomore year, and he's very deep thinker. I mean, very deep thinker. And we're having a conversation about the villain in Romeo and Juliet. Like, who's the villain? Who ultimately is fault for the way the tragedy happens? And he says, and I think I was thinking people, right? The whole time. People. The friar, Romeo, whatever. He said the feud. The feud is the villain, right? So it's not necessarily a villain, it's the antagonist. It's what pushes the story in that direction. So our antagonist, sorry to say, is Tom Osborne. If you want to blame one person, you gotta blame Tom
twist,
Osborne.
folks. Plot
Tom,
twist.
He's 60, he retires at 60. Okay? That's 12 years younger than Nick Saban just retired. He retires at 60 years old. He stays on a head coach. They win in 99. I remember watching that team in the Fiesta Bowl, kicking Tennessee's butt. They're carrying players off from Tennessee every other play because they're beating them so badly. Now, they pulled back late because that's the way Frank coached, but they could have put 50 up on Tennessee that day. Tom Osborne would have put up 50 that day. They ended up winning the national championship that year. Now, they lost to Texas and all that stuff, but I think they win. And then over the next 3 or 4 years, with the way he was dividing that offense and the way it was going, they're going to challenge for 2 or 3 more. So all of a sudden, you go from leaving in 97 to maybe having at least one more national championship and playing for another one by the time we even get to like 2003, 2004, when he's 67, maybe he retires then. It's a whole different story. Maybe by that point, maybe there's somebody else who could come up and take over the job from his coaching tree or not get somebody else. Ultimately, I love Tom Osborne. I really do. But he left early, and it put Nebraska in the predicament they are still in right now.
Wow.
Minds alone.
All-time what if.
And we talked about this in the first episode about when we talked about Solich, and he was basically honoring a promise he had made to Frank Solich. He
96,
he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to, he was young enough, had the energy, had the motivation. He wanted to keep coaching. And then of course, his last 5 years were like the epitome of a well-oiled machine. So Brandon, anything to add to that? No, go ahead. Sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
No, I was just, before Brandon jumps in, TJ, when we talk about these what if scenarios, we're referring to the Marvel comics, which I know you know nothing about. So we'll do our best to kind of guide you along as well.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate
You're
that,
welcome.
Jeff. Thank you.
Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can't really top naming Tom Osborne as the villain / antagonist here. I mean, to take Michael's son more, I guess, a different approach rather than looking for an individual. Like, it just, and partially because Osborne resigned early, like it never matched up timing wise. And we talk a lot about like going through, 5 coaches since Osborne's too many. But Nebraska's also gone through 5 ADs, and you got into this cycle where, you make your big hire with Callahan, you make your big bet and push all your chips into the table for Steve Peterson. Doesn't work out, well, you're gone. And then the next guy hires a guy, and he's judged based on that. And it was just a cycle they got into that's pretty difficult. I don't think there was ever it would be a different story at Nebraska if Steve Peterson had gotten the 04 hire right instead of, landing on maybe their 4th choice. And you'd had an AD that could be there through the whole time. It was like, yep, this is what it is. This is the vision that we're trying to execute. Nebraska didn't have that for, anything more than 4 or 5 years in most cases. So not as good an answer as Tom Osborne, but I think it's a factor in this.
Brandon, my kid's answer would be, and I almost gave this, the villain is the fan base.
Yeah. That's where I thought you were going with that.
The expectation, it's the coming back. It's the wife that's getting beat who keeps coming back.
Yeah.
On the Common Fan podcast, we will not accept that answer.
That's why I didn't give it. That's why I didn't give it. But I'm just talking about if it's the feud idea from Romeo and Juliet, it's the abstract of the fan base. So I hate using the word allowing it, but they continue to come back over and over again. So it allows you to continue to make mistakes over that period of time. So,
well, 100%. You could also argue that makes us the greatest fan base in the world. But anyway,
sure, yeah, the most abused fan base.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so we're gonna pivot here, and we are Common Fans. We're gonna get to the promise of Matt Rhule and looking forward. But Michael, I love talking about this stuff with you. So here's what we're gonna call this a lightning round.
Okay,
I'm gonna give you the question that was the theme for each of the first 5 episodes. Now, keep in mind, we spent an hour plus on each, like dissecting each of these questions and going over them from every angle. But I love you answer however you like, as long as you'd like, take it wherever you want to take it. But I'm gonna shoot at you. And guys, if we want to jump in and have a little discussion about each one, we can do that too. But I'm gonna shoot you these questions one at a time. Okay. First one, what if Nebraska had never fired Frank Solich?
Obviously, this has been a discussion that we've had hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours on the radio for so long. I always go back to this. In our old studio at 1620 The Zone, there was a poster of the 2004 seniors. There was a poster up there. And I remember thinking to myself, my God, the lack of talent that Solich brought in over the course of those last few years was tragic. I mean, literally, you look and you're like, who is the best player? Who's the best athlete in this group? And there really wasn't. I mean, the kickers, the punters probably were the best athletes. And so even though if he doesn't get fired, I still think they would have struggled because recruiting had dropped off so much. And when you get to the point where you're recruiting that poorly, I don't know. Now, does he keep Bo around for 2004 as a defensive coordinator? Does he stay another year for 2005 past the 2-year contract he had? If that's the case, I think Bo's defense was so abstract at the time for the Big 12 that I think he could have kept them in games, but I don't think they would have had necessarily the talent to be able to win a ton of games. And so I think it eventually would have ended anyway. Like I said before, I think after 2004, Peterson could have made the decision. I don't think that Frank would have ever had the 4 years of success that Bo Pelini had when he went to 09, 10, and 12 conference championship games. I don't think that would have happened. So I think eventually it gets to be the same thing where he ends up getting fired.
All right. Anybody have follow-ups or anything to add to that?
I don't.
Nope.
All right.
Nope.
Brandon?
I mean, I think the other thing is like Solich would have had to eventually transition away, I think, from kind of the pure or the type of option they were running. And I think he could have done that. We talked about on that episode that Tim Albin was a young coach on that staff who a year after Solich was fired, he took a year off, became his OC at Ohio, and now is the head coach at Ohio. So it's possible they could have done that, but in some ways, whether, well, we'll get to it in the next question with Bill Callahan. We know how that played out, but it did put a hard end to like, okay, well, it's not going to be a struggle of like small changes to kind of transition Nebraska to, I think, a more modern day offense.
Okay. All right. Next one. Michael, I'm really excited to hear your take on this because I think you might be different than where everybody else landed on this one. Would Bill Callahan have worked with more time?
So I've always been a defender of Bill Callahan. I have. I was alone in the wilderness, just yelling. No one was listening to me. This goes back to 2006. And I always say, if you want a what-if moment, Nebraska wins that Big 12 championship game in 2006. They beat Oklahoma. Maurice Purifies doesn't fumble on the first time he touches the ball. They win that game. Zach Taylor has 2 more miles per hour on a couple throws to the end zone. They have touchdowns instead of interceptions. All of that. that 2007 class was going to be magnificent. Maybe not 05, but it would have been pretty darn good. They win that game. Also, because they lost that game, Bill Callahan proceeded to have an entire offseason where they just concentrated on USC. That was it. They wore themselves out concentrating on USC. Once they lost the USC game, the season was over. It fell apart. I honestly believe, now, first of all, Callahan can't work if you hire Tom Osborne as the AD. It's oil and water. That wasn't going to work out. My crusty supervisors, he called him at one point. That's not going to happen. That wouldn't have survived. So you say you change ADs if you want, great, but you don't bring in Tom Osborne. You bring somebody from the outside in, right, who actually works with Bill Callahan, and Bill Callahan figures out a way to take his really good friend who's defensive coordinator and fires him. 08 with Joe Gans, that team, I think they could have won a bunch of games. I think they could have been really good under Bill Callahan with the way his offense was developing, with how good Joe Gans would have been in the offense, giving him a little bit more mobility than he had with Sam Keller. I think that could have worked out. I really do. I don't know how long he was going to hang around because he may have been looking to go back to the NFL or something else. Yeah. But I think that there was still oil in the ground. I think you had a chance. But with everything that happened, the losing of that 06 title game with Tom Osborne having been brought in once they fired Steve Peterson after Oklahoma State, then it couldn't work. But if you could change a few things, I think maybe it could have worked.
Interesting. But just so you're aware, Matt, Jeff, Brandon, Mitch Sherman, and myself all said no, he would not have worked with more time. But I appreciate that assessment. Brandon, anything?
No, really quick. There's no better scheme. Nebraska has not had a schemer in terms of red zone offense as well as Bill Callahan won since the day he left. And one of the other issues that I almost with besides turnovers is scoring in the red zone. Scoring in the red zone has been a dilemma for this program for so long. And ever since I started keeping finishing drive rate personally and they're tragically bad at that. They had a guy in Bill Callahan who actually knew how to coach red zone offense. So you guys can hate him all you want.
Brandon, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I had to make a call on that one, and I went the opposite way. But I would count myself as like more sympathetic to Callahan than the average person. And you know, that 07 season like went south in such a dramatic way that I mean, I know if you're a fan, you don't want to hear this, but like you kind of can almost write it off. And yeah, if the cost of doing that is, well, you got to make a change at D coordinator, then oh, by the way, like Sam Keller was their guy. And then Joe Gans comes in and kind of makes you think, well, maybe he should have been playing the whole time. Yeah. Would have played in 08, which we'll go to next. Mm-hmm. But Pelini goes 9-4 in his first season, you know, basically with that roster that Michael just mentioned. So let's go to Bo.
All right. Well, I will hate Callahan forever in case anybody wants to know. Michael. All right. Next one, Michael. Bo Leaver or Bo Leave-er?
I was always a believer. I never had issues with Bo. I worked with Joe Gans for a while over on the bottom line, and you know we'd talk about things that Bo did, and we knew the things that Bo did poorly. I always wished this for Bo Pelini: if you could have gone back a little bit and got him a head coaching job someplace else first, a small place, Wyoming, Ohio, someplace smaller, and then let him have the job here at Nebraska where he better understood how to handle the media, better how to handle anything, he'd have been a much better coach. But in general, I liked his defensive schemes for the most part. I thought he made some good decisions at times in terms of allowing players to play where they were at a better spot. Remember, Prince Amukamara was a running back, and they got him there like, you know what? We need a corner. You're built for it. Let's put him in the corner. He made some good decisions in terms of personnel. But the problem is always going to be his personality was so abrasive. You're in a place where Nebraska nice is a common expression, and you got a guy who's mean to everybody. Now, he never yelled at me, but everybody else I know in the business at some point got a phone call or some sort of pull aside and yelled at by a man who you can't do that. You can't do that in 2024 for sure. You shouldn't even been able to do it in 2011, 2010. But in general, I liked having him here. I probably would have fired him after 2013 because he asked to be fired. But then I probably wouldn't have fired him after 2014. You know, it's tough. It's tough to look at it. And I almost hope for him, wish that he would have left all those jobs, Penn State, Tennessee, Arkansas, whoever he applied for to go on, whatever rumors it was. I wish he would have gotten one of those jobs because he would have left. Let's go to DC for a second. He would have left the hero, right? He wouldn't have stayed around long enough to become the villain.
Yeah. Comic books, TJ. Comic book talk.
Some would say, I think this is, we brought this up on one of the episodes. I think the Bo fight is still the biggest fight in the fan base, more than Solich. Like some would still say he's a hero, right? And others,
Depends how old you are. Depends how old you are.
Suppose.
If you're in the 60s, you're in your 60s, you're like still fighting the Frank Solich argument.
That's true. All right, guys. Anybody else want to jump in on that one? Yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, this one was always kind of a 52%, 48% for me. Like based on the columns I was writing, which I was still pretty like a young columnist at the time. I was definitely in the believer more than believer category by the time we got to 2014 for a lot of reasons. And I think what keeps me there is knowing that, okay, if Eichhorst doesn't pull the plug after 14, and he didn't do it after 13, but to Michael's point, that was, I think, probably his better opportunity. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much longer Bo would have been there anyway. I mean, he looked at these other jobs. It was obviously like the leadership in terms of Eichhorst being directly above him, but also like some of the stuff that we heard, we weren't supposed to hear, but did hear, the weight of the Nebraska thing was getting to him. So that's a key part of this too. And having to navigate the conference switch is a big thing. Like you can look at it numbers wise and just see that it was, but it's an interesting one. Like there's no argument a decade on that, like we didn't find Bo Pelini's ceiling. The problem is like when you're in a college football palace, like you don't want to have a drop ceiling. Right. And, to one of his Youngstown comrades, like Nebraska won more than this because Nebraska, I think, has a better reputation. Well, definitely has a better reputation and still probably has slightly better resources, but thought like Mark Stoops at Kentucky. And now you can look at it and say, yeah, we'd be fine with being the Nebraska version of what Mark Stoops has done at Kentucky. But at the time, you're always going to get tired with status quo, I guess, is how it goes. That's the nature of college football.
How many games did they win in 2015 with Bo and his staff?
That's a great question.
I can tell you this.
Wow.
Two things they couldn't do with Mike Riley's staff that they could have done with Bo's staff is one, they couldn't stop the pass at all. They had the worst strategy. Oh. I made a bet with a guy that more than 6 quarterbacks would throw for over 300 yards on the season after watching them in the spring. And that happened, and they couldn't run the ball out of the shotgun. They didn't know how. They had never done it. They didn't know how to scheme it, and so that never worked out. They'd have been able to do those two things under Bo. Now, would it have been perfect? No, but that schedule looked like it should have been an 8 or 9 wins season. But
yeah, I mean, I think they beat BYU and Illinois for sure. The Purdue loss.
You said BYU, Illinois. Yep.
Yeah, BYU and Illinois for sure. The Purdue loss was such a weird one because remember we lost by like 10. They didn't even show up, kind of thing. But that could have been an entirely different game. Yeah. And then I'm trying to remember some of those other just awful losses. Wisconsin was kind of down that year. That was a close game. That was the Andy Janovich, pulled back, 3 minutes ago, right? That one. So anyway,
I know.
Holy smokes, that's a great question, Michael. So that's a good. So go ahead, go ahead.
15 should have been like 7.5 wins, and they won 5. And we talked about this during the Riley episode. 16 was 9 wins, should have been about 7.5. So put Bo in 15. he probably gets to where he always was. Probably gets to 9.
Yeah. Right. All right. Nice segue back to our theme of the episode. Great segue here. Was Mike Riley the biggest miss of the post-Osborne era?
I gave it. The biggest miss is hiring Frank Solich and not going out and taking the advantage of coming off as being a legendary program. Now, I know not everybody wants to follow a legend, but it's been done many times. And so I mentioned this already. It's Bob Stoops, getting him as your head coach after Osborne decides to step down. He goes to Bob Stoops and says, hey, listen, I know that you have a lot of goals and places, but I want you to come to Nebraska and follow me. I think maybe he does that. There were other guys you could have chosen too. A random one was Gary Pinkel, who was at Toledo and was having a good career at Toledo and ended up in Missouri. That's a guy like that. But the funniest one ever, and you may have seen this video before, but Trev Alberts is on. He's a TV commentator. I'm not sure if it's CBS or if he's on ESPN, but he's on there and he's begging for Kurt Ferentz to leave Iowa and come to Nebraska to be the head football coach. And that obviously wasn't going to happen, but that was one. But the biggest mistake by far, and I don't think it's Mike Riley, it's keeping Frank Solich. And I think Frank Solich is a great coach, and he did a lot of great things at Ohio. He's going to get it. If he doesn't already have it, he's going to get a statue outside, and that's wonderful. And they should name everything after him, and that's wonderful. And he's a great guy. But that is a guy with no coaching experience should not have been taking head coaching experience, not even play calling experience, should have been taking over at that time the University of Nebraska.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Riley was still a massive swing and miss, though.
Oh, it was dude, this is what they did. So I was working in the newspaper at the time, right? And they love to do this. They love to get, and I'm sure Brandon does this too. They love to get a consensus from everybody, right? So what we would do is they said, send us your top 10 coaches who maybe Nebraska could hire. And we all sent them in. They had like a list of 82. Mike Riley wasn't on a list of 82 coaches.
We talked about this. Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Think about that. All of us, all sports fans, all football fans, we used to joke, me and my buddy Ed, we used to joke, a little gambling. We used to always call Mike Riley every other year Mike, because every other year he would have a crazy upset that would win you money, but the next year he'd be the favorite and he would lose games, right? He did it every other year. It was the craziest thing. And what did he do? 15, 16, 17. He never changed while he was 500. And so, yes, it was the weirdest hire ever, but they were going for what a lot of businesses do. They were looking for Mr. Nice Guy coming off of Mr. Mean Guy.
Yeah.
Looking for Mr. Disciplinarian off, like the kind of thing.
I said the same thing in that episode about that hire, that he was the anti-Pelini. But if you've listened to any of the other podcasts, these guys fondly refer to me as like George Costanza of our group. So I always find something to complain about. Yeah. So the one thing that jumps out to me is George Costanza always lived by the fact that if everything and every instinct that you do is wrong, then wouldn't the opposite have to be right?
Right.
And I feel like that was the consensus with hiring Riley was, let's just do the opposite and everything's going to work out perfectly.
Hey, Brandon, wasn't it a sabotage by Barry Alvarez? Wasn't that what it was? It was a sabotage by Barry Alvarez, right? Barry Alvarez, who I, of course, knew very well, recommended him hiring Mike Riley. Sabotage.
He definitely did. And I mean, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about Icorse. Like, I think he did some things, like he was a great behind the scenes guy.
Oh, heck yeah.
Like, I think he did a lot of things well that way. But you think about college football today, I know it still happens occasionally, but if you're going to go like lone wolf and not get a search firm or use any of the tools that are out there and pretty common for a coaching hire, I think you got to do one of two things. Well, first you got to be right. And if you can't be right, better to be bold. And this was neither of those. Like, this was just, and like we talked about it on the Riley episode, like you can talk yourself into the value play of it. It's like, well, did this at Oregon State. Like, maybe if you give him Nebraska resources, it turns into. But what would it have turned into? Like, at best, maybe as good as Bo. Like, maybe. So, I mean, I think that's it.
Yeah, the cook in the kitchen.
Bottom line.
The cooking in the kitchen analogy killed me. First of all, I'm like a little amateur chef. I love to cook, right? I don't care what ingredients you give me. I'm not going to cook as well as Emerald. I'm not going to cook as well as anybody else. So the whole like, well, he was at Oregon without the stuff for the kitchen, and they gave him the stuff for the kitchen. No. You either can cook or you can't cook. It doesn't matter. And that was a guy who could cook. He just couldn't.
The career 500 coach who had never won a conference championship, went 500 and didn't win a conference championship.
Yep.
Shocker.
Exactly.
All right. Last one, Michael. How in the world did Scott Frost not work out at Nebraska?
All right. I started earlier with literature, talking about Romeo and Juliet. This goes back to Canterbury Tales. My love. I love British lit. It got me from being a stupid student to being a pretty good student. Loved it so much. Thank you, Dr. Gray, for getting me into British literature. Anyway, I love the idea of something about your personality is always going to be your downfall, right? That's just the way Chaucer thought about it. That's the way it works in literature usually, and sometimes in comic books and Star Wars as well. So hubris is the main reason. Hubris is why Scott Frost failed. And it comes down to three things, right? Because he'd always had a little bit of success, right? So whether it be, I mean, I know what happened at Stanford, but other than that, he comes back to Nebraska, still wins a national championship, makes really good decisions as an assistant coach, gets some really nice gigs, ends up an offensive coordinator in the hottest offense in the world at Oregon, ends up going to UCF and winning a fake national championship, right? It all had gone well for him. So he was at the level of hubris where I can do whatever I think I want to do and it will work. You cannot bring a group of coaches without any Big Ten experience into the Big Ten. It was one of the best coach conferences in the country. It's the most different of the at that time, major conferences in the country. That the first decision he made was bringing his coaching staff with him was wrong. You cannot do that. That leads into the second mistake. You got to get talent to play in the Big Ten. Well, if you got coaches who don't know the talent in the Big Ten, how are they going to get players to play in the Big Ten? So one, wrong coaching staff, needed to hire some experience in the Big Ten. Two, needed players who could play in the Big Ten. And the third part is partly not his fault. Okay, I'm a big person. As a parent of two boys, I believe in this. You cannot be an enabler. You have to be an authority figure. Love my boys. I love them. But you got to be an authority figure. You can't be an enabler. He had an AD who was an enabler. Bill Moose was having fun. It was his last job. He was retiring. He wasn't worried about putting the laws down. Imagine if the hiring in 2017 happens and they bring in Scott Frost and his AD is Trev Alberts. Now, they'd have had to figure out their system. There had been some orientation that would have had to happen, but he would have put a hierarchy in place. He would have set boundaries. He would have made Scott Frost a better coach. Would it have worked? I can't guarantee that, but it had a better chance of working than having a guy who was an enabler, who wasn't an authority figure, who he had as his AD. Those are the three things. That's why it failed, but mostly hubris.
I love that.
Yeah, that
Damn.
was good. Brandon, anything to add to that?
No, I'll put a pin in come back to that when we talk about Matt Rhule a little bit. But I think I might be wrong. I think hubris was the word that came to mind for me when we did the Frost episode. So I've always kind of been big on that corner as well, but have never said it as eloquently as Michael just did.
Yeah, we're all, and I think Brandon knows this. When you're in this business and you talk a lot, you say a lot of stuff that's wrong. You say a lot of stuff, maybe that's medium, something that's right. But in the end, you have to know your spot, right? You have to know who you are, who I am. I'm not a guy who played the sport. I'm not a guy who coached the sport. I'm talking to you as a fan who loves the sport. Brandon knows numbers. There's a lot of things. He's a great writer, one of the best writers in the market. Sam McEwen played some high school football, did some things, but he has a spot. I don't think Scott ever understood his place in where he was. And he should have known it better than anybody. But he never did, which I'm still sad about it. I wanted it to work. I told everybody it was going to work. I thought it was going to be great. Yeah.
Well, Michael, I don't want to take us down a side rabbit hole, but I want to ask one question about talking about the Frost era. You gave that interview after he was fired, talking about him being late to meetings and sort of some issues there. And we're not going to get into the rumors, and we're like, we're not going to get into any of that. But it sounds like at the very least, there were some accountability issues for the football part of it, right?
Right.
So my question is and I think when we're not winning, the fan base wants blood. They want, they say they're yelling at the media for not doing their job. We're just trying to understand, if people know that's happening for the state's highest paid employee, how much does the fan base deserve to know? Or if somebody's got verification that that's happening, should that have been reported before he was fired?
I've been through this. I still occasionally, that thing gets retweeted occasionally still today. And, people will say that to me about what we should have said, if I wasn't getting out, remember that was my last little bit of time in the business. I was getting out of the business. I was leaving the radio show. I was moving on to go work at the city of Papillion. If I wasn't in that situation, I probably wouldn't have done that. I did that I was mad because of something that one of the kids that were on the show said about the reason why he was fired, and that all that just came out. I don't know if it's our responsibility as the media to tell you all the things that are wrong with the program outside of what's happening on the field and what's happening with the players. I don't know if it's our responsibility. I would tell you, if it was the 1950s and 60s and 70s, it never would have come out, because the media was such good friends with coaches and everybody that they wouldn't do that kind of thing. Nowadays, maybe that's changed a little bit because there is this divide between the media and everybody else. So maybe it would. Damon and I talked a lot on the radio those 2 years about what was wrong with the program. We never said all the things I said, but we said a lot of things that if you were listening, maybe you call them code, I don't know, but we tried to talk about the problems in the program as much as we could without saying this guy's got to be reeled in. That's on us. Maybe that's on us. Maybe
Yeah.
but everybody knew, everybody heard things, the coaching staff wasn't happy. They were telling people in the media what was happening. So obviously, I don't know. I never should have done that. I would, if I could go back, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have done it. But it was Saints had beaten Atlanta. We were down 17-0. We came back. I was fired up. I was all fired up. I was filled with hubris, I guess. I don't know, but I just
Full circle.
I wish I wouldn't have done it, but whatever.
Well, that's a super candid answer and really
Yeah.
appreciate it. And I wasn't meaning to direct that at you. I feel like after the fact, you hear it referenced all the time, to your point, as if it was sort of common knowledge among the media. So I think it's an interesting question to explore.
Right,
but
right.
you know what we need to do? We need to move on. Husker fans need to move on, and the program needs to move on. And we don't want to suggest that we have outsized influence here on the Common Fan podcast. Part of our goal of the Reckoning series is to air our grievances, to go back to the Seinfeld theme, to have an airing of grievances,
Sure.
and to talk about these items that are of great interest to the fan base. But part of what we're doing is to try to do our small part to exorcise the demons of the past,
Exercise the demons,
and help the program move forward into that the Winston Churchill line, that the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. And so we are going to move forward, and we're going to talk about Matt Rhule, and we're going to talk about the promise of Matt Rhule. Very big picture question to start. What stands out to you about Matt Rhule as a head coach now that you've observed him for over a year here in Nebraska?
Let me say, I started in the business. I was an intern in 93, 94 in New Orleans. And I was around Jim Morrow, the senior. And Jim would give you whatever answer was off the top of his head. It didn't matter if it was the right one or whatever. He just said because he was older and he didn't care anymore. It's like, I'm going to say whatever I want. Matt Rhule is the most thoughtful coach I've ever interviewed in football. There's some really interesting coaches when it comes to women's basketball that I interviewed and like track and field, but he is thoughtful. He turns over every single stone and looks for the answer. That's what he does. That's what I like about him. He's always got to answer your question. And by the way, he's always thought about it. He's already thought about it. Before you ask the question, Matt Rhule has sat there in front of a mirror or whatever and said, somebody's going to ask me this. Let me have an answer for it. And I love that about him. And I think that's what's going to eventually lead to fixing this turnover thing. He's going to keep turning over stones and not giving it up until it actually happens. And if you go to their practices, which we went to, they're running these different stations of balls on a string and fumble recoveries and fumbles. They're going to figure it out because he does not let anything go, whether it's knowing how many hours of rest you need after going on a road trip, or knowing what kind of times you need to be on the grass in the practice field, or thinking about the whole idea of the sun moving the other side of the stadium. We talked about that before he ever coached a game at Nebraska. So he was already thinking about it. It's that makes him special.
Love it.
Awesome. Outstanding.
Brandon, anything to add to that?
Yeah. In addition to thoughtful, which I think is a really good word, I would choose humble for Matt Rhule. I think with these coaching hires, you've got two big forces. You've got the respect and knowledge a coach has earned for himself through all of his stops. For Matt Rhule as a player at Penn State, all of his assistant stops, head coach Temple, head coach Baylor, even the NFL. That's good enough to get him the Nebraska job. You show up at a place that has its own sort of earned respect and institutional knowledge in Nebraska. And in Nebraska, even despite the past 2 decades, it's still pretty high. It's one of the 10 winningest programs of all time. How those two things fit together, I think is really, really important. I don't think Bill Callahan chafed against it, I think. Scott Frost, I think, chafed against it. I think Bo Pelini eventually did. And Mike Riley was just kind of one last adventure, right? It was his is kind of a tough one to categorize for me. I think the thing that stands out to me about Rhule is he has come in and said, like, here's what I know how to do. Here's what I've done that has worked, but let me learn about the place that I'm at. And I think that's what stands out to me, at this stage, which we haven't even seen his second season yet, but that's been consistent from the very first time he spoke as Nebraska's head coach, I think.
Losing at Carolina helped him too, right? Losing at Carolina. Not only humbled him, but
humbled
showed
him. I think kind of let him know what it was that was where his spot was, to go back to something you mentioned about Frost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Michael, you mentioned that Coach Rhule is very thoughtful. He's thinking way ahead. Do you think Coach Rhule seems like one of those guys who can potentially kind of be running a well-oiled machine, even as assistants might come and go? Specifically thinking here about Tony White. I mean, the majority of Husker fans are in love with Tony White right now, and rightfully so. But the kind of the writing, I think, is on the wall that he might be here a year, maybe two, but he's probably going to get a head coaching gig at some point. But do you think Coach Rhule is able to be at a place where he's building something to where we lose a guy like Tony White or a different good assistant, but because the head man is so good, we can kind of plug and play with a new assistant and not lose a beat?
Let me say something to Brandon. Why in 2014 did Nebraska go from almost last in special teams to being almost first in special teams? Why did that happen?
Oh, gee.
Because Bo Pelini took it over. Bo Pelini said,
That's right.
This is the thing I'm fixing. You'll never have a poor defense on a Matt Rhule's team, ever, because Matt Rhule concentrates on being good at defense. I like Tony White. He's great. He leaves. They'll bring somebody else in. Matt Rhule runs his offense to help his defense. He takes good athletes. Go back and look at Temple or Baylor. He'll take athletes that are between offense, defense, and put them on defense. Doesn't mind doing that. A lot of coaches won't do that. They want to put them on offense. He does all those things. He's going to have a good defense. Even as things were falling apart in Carolina, and I'm a Saints fan, so I watch them 2 times a year. Even as things were falling apart, the defense kept getting better. They couldn't figure out the quarterback, which so many teams in the NFL happens to. They couldn't figure out the quarterback. And they couldn't figure out the offensive coordinator. So I will say on one side of it, I think he's always going to have a great defense. Now, I am concerned a little bit about the offense. He brought Joe Brady in, a guy who at LSU was an incredible offensive coordinator, great offensive mind. He ended up having to fire him midseason. What was that all about? Then he brings in a guy in McAdoo, the former Giants coach. I'm like, what are you bringing him in for? Why is he going to fix things? So I don't. And then Marcus Satterfield. I don't see that as an answer to a question of how do I have great offense in the Big Ten? I don't. And maybe it works out. Maybe it does. Now that they have Thomas in there and those guys are working together, I don't know. But I just know this. That's a guy who South Carolina fans were not sad to see go. That's not the ultimate judgment of anything, because fans don't know. We don't know a lot. But anyway, they didn't want him back. So I worry about how he hires on offense. I don't worry about his defense. I think his defense is going to be good no matter what. I think he'll fix special teams because, again, he's going to make sure it gets fixed, whether it be Ed Foley getting it fixed or putting more starters on special teams or whatever else. He's going to get that fixed. Offense, I don't know about his offensive mind. I just don't. I think he knows what he wants to do, but at the same time, I think he thinks too much. Minnesota, Maryland, other times down by the goal. I don't know about his offensive acumen.
Well,
Brandon, anything to add there?
Yeah, I love hearing that about the D. Nebraska should always have a great defense. Sorry, Brandon, go ahead.
But no, and I agree they will under Rhule, and it's primarily playing defense is reaction. It's a lot of mindset and like work ethic, and as a head coach, like it's kind of your job to control that for both sides of the ball. But I think it particularly shows up on defense and on special teams too, which kind of makes special teams from 2023 stand out a little bit for that reason. But I think they'll get that piece of it fixed, and I don't think the Satterfield fan club, and I'm just talking about it in Nebraska, I think like nationally, like it's not huge. Like there's not a lot to point to, but what you do point to is, when he was paired up with Rhule 2 or 3 years into his rebuild. And like, we'll see how year 2 goes with the addition of a quarterbacks coach and a quarterback, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yes. Excellent segue there, talking about defense. If you've listened to any of the previous episodes, one of our rallying cries is our defense is awesome, and hopefully it will continue to be awesome. And just how many more games we probably could have won if our offense was just average. Like they didn't even need to blow the doors off anybody. If they were just average with that defense that we had last year, you could add at least probably 2-3 more wins to the schedule last year. So we've added our quarterback, as Brandon just said, possibly as a quarterback. We've got Luke Skywalker coming in to save us from the dark side of the empire. Do you think they can figure out a formula on offense that's going to complement that defense and make it work in the Big Ten?
I think we know the formula. The formula is laid out, whether it's the NFL reference they make to the 49ers or if it's the college reference, which would be Michigan, right? So you've got to be a team that runs the ball more than 60% of the time. Not a lot more, 61, 62% of the time. I think that's the sweet spot for running the ball here at Nebraska and winning. I think you have to have both a controlled passing game that can pick you up first downs when it's 3rd and 5, 3rd and 3, and you have to have an explosive run game. So that means in Nebraska had last year, they either they were first or second in the nation in explosive runs per game. Because if you have a controlled passing game that can pick you up that 3rd and 5, 3rd and 3, you can break some long runs on 3rd down because they're playing pass, right? And you can do that. I think if you do those things, and it's what San Francisco does, using the middle of the field beautifully. How many times you see passes with the Niners in the middle of the field? It's incredible how good Purdy is at throwing the ball over the middle of the field. And that's because you got a great tight end and you got some big physical wide receivers. Nebraska's getting that now with some of the guys they brought in. If they can use the middle of the field, they run the ball at a reasonable percentage. I don't believe in 50-50. I will never believe in 50-50. I don't. Unless you've got Ohio State at its best talent, and I still don't think they were 50-50. They're probably like 53-47, something like that. But I believe in over 60%, control passing and pick up those 3rd downs and explosive runs. That's how you win the Big Ten for Nebraska.
Sure. There you go.
That's right. Going to have common fans frothing at the mouth. All right. So Michael,
Brandon,
what do you think? Sorry, Brandon, what do you think?
Deep thinks this stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's largely it. I think in terms of the juncture they're at right now is interesting with the prospect of a Dylan Raiola, which, is the best for the era we have rankings for. The best recruit Nebraska's ever signed, probably maybe the best quarterback they will ever sign. Just, realistically, like that's been the history. So that's interesting. I think, long term, maintaining that level of offense that is truly meant as a complement of the defense. In January, Matt Rhule said, we're always going to have a good defense. When he was talking about Tony White being mentioned for other jobs. And I believe that's true. So then your offense needs to best complement that. I think their ability to do that long-term will be about their ability to evaluate its skill position talent, right? Nebraska could, make 3 straight playoffs. It's still not going to be the program who has a hat on the table on signing day alongside Ohio State, Alabama, and Georgia. Just not consistently. It's not. So how do you get around not having, a quarterback? Upgrade your skill talent. You got great receivers. You got great running backs. That can help a lot. And Nebraska wasn't at that point last year. I like the receiver group this year. We'll see where they get to. I think they've got some really promising young guys that this coaching staff selected. And then you got the 2 transfers who can maybe help fast forward things a little bit right away. But that's what it is. For them, it's develop on the O-line and evaluate the heck out of it at skill positions, which, if you're thinking to yourself, that's kind of a lot like, well, Iowa offense is not a great example. Let's go with vintage Wisconsin. That sounds a lot like Wisconsin. I think that's the way forward.
Yeah. Michael, if Coach Rhule gets this thing humming, gets Nebraska back to competing for, and all common fans hope, winning conference championships, which gets you in the playoff conversation, what will be the main reasons why? Reasons?
I want to start off this section of this apologizing to everyone. I'm just going to be honest, right? I'm not trying to blow smoke with anybody. I'm not trying to.
What are you going to do here? What are you going to do?
I'm just saying. I do not believe you will be able to judge Nebraska's success on winning conference championships. That's not it. Currently, the success would be in the top half of the Big Ten, and then eventually top 4. If you can get in the top 4 of the Big Ten, I think you're being successful. This is a deep conference, right? And if you're in the top 4, you're probably winning 10 games, which probably puts you in the conversation for the college football playoff expanded edition of it, right? And so that's what you're looking at. The idea of Nebraska winning conference championships now without the divisions I just don't see it. I don't see Nebraska finishing in the top 2 consistently to get into the conference championship game. I just don't. And so you don't worry about that. Don't concentrate on that. Concentrate on winning as many games as possible and putting yourself in position to get picked when they're doing the selection show for the college football playoff. And there's going to be a point where, with everything happening with conferences, where the Big Ten and the SEC are going to get 4 or 5 in each. And so maybe you're one of those to get in there and do that. I think that is it. Now, this obviously is going to work if, as you mentioned earlier, Dylan Raiola is the guy. If he's the guy and they consistently get playmakers around him, make special teams a special again, then they'll have a chance. But in terms of challenging to win the conference, I'd love to see it happen. I just don't see it happening in the future for Nebraska because it's a tough conference. It's deep, man.
Is getting to the playoff going to be the new
BCS Bowl?
Is that well, definitely, but is that going to be like the new accolade that we cite instead of citing conference championships or division titles? It'll be so. We have 4 playoff appearances, or X number of indicator. 9. The kind of the new indicator. Exactly.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's the biggest bonus those coaches are going to have in their contract. That bonus is going to be huge to get to the conference, to get to the college football playoff for sure. And it's where you have to target. Nebraska used to say, well, what we need to do? We got to beat Oklahoma. Right. And then you'd say, we got to win the conference. Right. Yeah. And then we win the conference, we're going to have a chance to win a national championship. Nowadays is not win the conference, it's getting to the college football playoff. And that should be the mentality of getting to that point. And scheduling is important. Scheduling, and Coach Rhule said it, and there was this backlash from some people. And I was like, dude, no, get into the college football playoff by hook or crook, by playing whoever you have to play. Do not pad the schedule get into the college football playoff. And the way you get in is 10, 11 wins. That's how you get in.
Yep.
Yeah, I think playoff bids is absolutely the marker going forward. We just haven't seen it yet. In January, I went back and looked at the 10 years of 4 teams that we had using the 12 team and the final rankings. Mm-hmm. Penn State would have made it 6.
Yep.
6 times. So to Michael's point, be top 4 in the Big Ten. That's basically, over the previous decade, Ohio State, Michigan-ish, a little bit different prior to Jim Harbaugh, but Ohio State, Michigan, or Michigan State, if you're going back to when Nebraska joined the conference, Penn State, and then the best team in the West. And I think it's going to take 9, 10 wins. I agree, to get there. And that puts you in the hunt. The other team that would have made 6, 12 team playoffs over that stretch, Oklahoma. Now they would have won a bunch of conference titles because the Big 12 is different, but 18 team league, it's going to be tough. It would be nice, I think, for Nebraska fans to get that none since 99 tagline removed, but keep yourself in the hunt. That's kind of what it was, when I was back with Pelini and it was like touch or go. It's like, don't underestimate being in the hunt. You got to be in the hunt. Yeah. So getting there for this current staff, I think, would be job well done.
Yeah. Well, Michael and Brandon, do you think that's attainable with Matt Rhule? Do you think that maybe is the ceiling, is top 4 or 5 in the Big Ten and winning 10 games? Is that the ceiling?
I wish I could talk about what ifs. I wish I could take this schedule and put it in 2026 and say, Dylan Raiola Jr., 2 years of starting quarterback under, and here's your schedule. Then I would say yes, for sure. But I look ahead to 2026 and I pulled this up. They said Tennessee, Ohio State, Washington, at Oregon, and at Iowa. It's not crazy, but that's 5 games you could lose, right? Yeah. It just is. And then there's some other games on the schedule scattered in there. You never know. So it comes down to, because of what's going on with the one big conference, that you have to get that right schedule. It's got to hit right for you. And then, yes, you can do that. If they're going to be as good as Ohio State year after year, it's not going to happen. You're not going to be recruiting at that level. The hat's on the table, as Brandon was talking about. It's not going to happen. It's just not. But hit the right schedule, get in that right spot. 1 game scenario, playing maybe a home game at Nebraska in the winter. I don't know. It's a possibility. Then you have a shot to get to where you want to get. But there's no way I can say that they're going to be on the par with Ohio State. Or going to be challenging constantly to winning the conference.
Yeah. No, I mean, no one's really at that level. That's why they're kind of that's the bar, right? And not too many teams can say they've been as consistently good as Ohio State over the last 12, 15 years.
Because of quarterbacks.
Right.
Sam McEwen did a story a few years ago talking about Clemson and said, you know what's hard is getting back-to-back-to-back quarterbacks. And they did it. They Taj Boyd, really good for Clemson level. Then you had Deshaun Watson, who I voted for Heisman twice.
Mm-hmm.
Feel bad based off of his off-the-field stuff, but I voted for him twice. And then 3, you hit Trevor Lawrence, who maybe was the best one. Yeah. That's hard to do. Ohio State's done it before. Oregon came close. That's the thing, man. If you can get back-to-back-to-back quarterbacks, then all bets are off with your height. But it's really hard. It's almost impossible to do.
Yeah.
Oof. Hard to do. And all 3 of those programs, consistently recruit at a higher level in Nebraska.
Right.
Too, which is the other piece. I was talking about skill position talent earlier. It's kind of a workaround that I think you have to realistically consider. But yeah, nothing's as singular as a singular quarterback.
Well, maybe we can just stay in the Raiola bloodlines, and Dayton turns out to be
TJ
as good as Dylan.
TJ Latif throws a ball, and the first time I watched him throw a pass on tape, now obviously it wasn't in person, I said, that's the best release I've seen from a sophomore, junior level quarterback since Zane Flores has it, but that's about it. That's a great release. That's a 4-year in the NFL release. I'm telling you.
Heck yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yes.
His feet are perfect. His balance, the way he lets go of the ball. I was like, what the hell is this? Before I knew Nebraska was even he was gonna commit to Nebraska. He just that kid's got potential.
So potentially 3 Elite 11 quarterbacks on the Nebraska roster next year, right?
Yeah, with Kalen. Yep.
Exactly. Who'd ever thought that?
Not here. No, you over there.
Tell TJ's got his hand up. Yeah, of course. Guy. Mr. Kool-Aid drinker. Hey, I'm guilty too.
I just want to say thank you to Michael for coming in here and keeping it real and keeping TJ grounded in reality. Because we're not going to win it. We're not going to win a conference championship every year, TJ. You heard it here first.
Yeah, so but Jeff, we've got to have hope. We've got to have hope. What else is there? If we don't have hope, what do we have?
Yeah, you're right.
Misery, I believe.
Misery, yeah. So yeah, segue alert, misery. Yeah. I'd like to end on a positive note, but I guess not. If Coach Rhule does fall short, if this were to happen, I hate even uttering that statement, but if he were to fall short,
Jeff, do you hate it?
No, I'm sorry. If he doesn't get Nebraska over that hump, what will be the reason or reasons, do you think? I'm assuming turnovers is one of them.
Well, the number one thing, as you know, in the Army, we always did nomenclature stuff, right? So Quebec Bravo, QB. That's it, man. It's the bottom line. You can go look across the country. Even Michigan, who had trouble getting off over the hump. No matter what you think about JJ McCarthy, that dude lost 2 games as a high school player. Lost 2 games, I think, as a college player. It's a winner. They finally got the right quarterback in that had to make the plays on 3rd down to get them first downs behind their running and their defense, right? You get a good quarterback, things will work. If you don't get a good quarterback, or you have quarterback injuries, or something happens where the wrong guy leaves, you keep the right guy, or you keep the wrong guy and the right guy leaves, then you're just not going to win. That is college ball right now. And hopefully, with having Dylan for however many years, and then maybe Callahan, and then maybe Latif, and then maybe the other, I don't know how it works, but if you can somehow do that and keep those guys and make them and have them stay and not transfer and not have to get into that carousel of getting portal quarterbacks every year that you see other teams having to do, like Northwestern got into that carousel. I mean, that doesn't work. Even though they won the amount of games they won last year, they won it with like 3 different quarterbacks, all like transfers. It was crazy. So you have to hit on quarterback, man. In the league now, we just saw it in the draft, right? 6 guys that fast in the draft because quarterback's the thing you have to hit. And if Nebraska hits it, they're going to win. If they don't hit it, they're not going to win.
Brandon, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think anything can change things as drastically as that quarterback point can, but in the interest of giving something else, like if their plan, if they're not as good on the O-line as I think they believe they can be, that's going to be an issue. Somewhat, not quite regardless of QB play, but it heavily influences it. I kind of look at the O-line going into 2024 of like, okay, saw some slight gains from 2022 to 23. Let's see. You got a ton of experience. And I think they have the ability to be pretty deep there because they're not scared to put guys in and find out earlier than a lot were. But you look at O-line, like I think you've got to recruit an elite tackle. That's just you got to go out on the market and get one. The other guys at the college level, at least, I think you can develop, and they'll be defined by that. In addition to quarterback, and if it doesn't go well, like we're talking about, okay, if the new marker for Nebraska is top 4 in the Big Ten, like Nebraska, I think has to get back to being a program where it's just like, well, it doesn't really matter who's coming back, who's not. Like just pencil that O-line in for one of the top 4, 5, 6 in the league. So if it doesn't work, I'm going to guess that the O-line never quite got to that point. And I wouldn't put it at that point now, entering 2024, even though there are a lot of reasons, I think, to be pretty optimistic about the season.
Yeah. I like the offensive line in terms of the depth. I think the young guys coming up, but I look at last year. Remember they had Walter Rouse committed for like a minute. I think he ended up being like a 5th or 6th round pick. You think about that. It's the guy at left tackle, the difference that might have made last year. You're so right about offensive tackle. If I'm going to hand out money in NIL, obviously quarterbacks, but my next one is probably defensive tackle and then offensive tackle. That's where my money's going. If you build there, you're going to win. And Nebraska hasn't been consistent building there,
Right.
Yeah. And behind those 3, I would put wide receiver and quarterback. But those they're more available. Like D tackles, I mean, are just like unobtainium. Yeah. Those guys are tough, particularly in the portal. So you kind of gotta either recruit really well and win some big time battles, or you gotta develop a guy there too.
Well, this has been a phenomenal and thoroughly engaging and enjoyable discussion. But brings us to the final verdict of the Common Fans. And on this one, it is the promise of Matt Rhule. Normally we have a question we're examining. So I guess what we're looking at here when it comes to the promise of Matt Rhule is, can he get us back to that, whatever that place is that Husker fans can be happy with? In my estimation, that's probably at least 9 wins a year. Some seasons, everything goes right. It's more in the 10 to 12 range. You're getting to the playoff, or you're at least in that conversation in November. Maybe every now and then you're winning the conference, or you're playing in the conference championship game, if it still exists in the future in this new world of college football. But, I think Husker fans, especially after what we've been through the last 7, 8, 10 years, I think Husker fans would be thrilled with a program that's competitive, a program they can be proud of, a program that plays good defense, a program that doesn't turn the ball over, a program that's consistently, certainly top 25, and a lot of seasons maybe top 10 or 15. Can Matt Rhule, I guess the question is, can Matt Rhule be the coach that gets us to that point? I want to give Brandon and Michael the last words. So Jeff, I'll give you a chance to not end on a negative note if you so choose.
Well, I just wanted to say that the one thing I think that he can, obviously I have hope. So I'm not trying to be negative at all, but they do and probably will run into Notre Dame in the playoff consistently. So if they do, that could be a problem for them. So
I think we made it. I think we made it through every Reckoning episode without you mentioning Notre Dame, and here we go again.
Sorry.
Excellent point. Excellent point. I'm glad you're a believer. I'm glad you're optimistic, Mattio.
Yeah, I think he can. I mean, and I'm a I guess self-aware Kool-Aid drinker because it's just in my nature. I'm a glass half full kind of guy, especially with Husker football. But I think personnel wise, I think I see him doing a pretty good job of recruiting and developing and getting the portal guys when they need them. And then I think Matt Rhule and his preparation, like we talked about, his thoughtfulness. The guy genuinely seems to want to be the coach at Nebraska and embraces all that comes with it. And I think that's a huge part of it. I mean, we've talked about, Coach Bo, and that really wasn't a thing for him. And it seemed like maybe the whole situation was maybe a little too big, or Scott Frost wasn't really ready for it. But I think Coach Rhule embraces it. So yeah, I think he can get us back to where we want to be.
I love to hear it. I believe he can. I believe he will. I think, to the point that was made earlier, I think he will not rest. I think he will turn over every stone to fix the things that need to be fixed and get things to the place that he wants to get them to. And I think the stars, to your point, Matteo, I think the stars have aligned a bit for us to where, he always had he'd do these turnaround jobs and then he'd have a better opportunity. And I think the stars have aligned a little bit in that his family's in a place that maybe he doesn't want to move as much. He doesn't want to keep moving the family. I think also he's landed at a place that he's realized he loves, I don't think that the storyline of what if the Penn State job opened or whatever is maybe as compelling as it was before the 2023 season. I think that Nebraska is a place that we know if you get it going, it is a blue blood. It is one of the top programs in the country. Why would you leave and go somewhere else? And so I think the combination of the type of guy that he is, the type of coach that he is, and the fact that I do think he will stay for the long term bodes well for Nebraska. So I'm definitely a believer in drinking the Rhule-Aid as well. Brandon.
He'll win double-digit games in a season here, assuming that what you just said, crazy things happen. Who knows? Like, assuming he is here three plus seasons, which to your point, he hasn't been at a college spot that long, but this is different. Each of those jumps made sense. It's like what you do when you're moving up the career ladder. But I think he will win double-digit games here. That puts you in the playoff discussion at I think the very worst. And he'll do it because I think he's really focused on the craft piece of it. And maybe this is a reaction to the Frost era. That was something I always felt that was missing. Like, they didn't talk a lot about that. Like, you just got to want to be good at this for the sake of being good at it, at a place like Nebraska in particular. And it was that place for a long time.
Yeah. Great call. Michael?
All right, so I know that Matt Rhule is a listener to this podcast, so I say this.
Thank you.
I say this to Matt Rhule. This is your only goal. Your only goal is to avoid Nebraska fans having to receive emails and memes from Iowa fans showing that they're a tier 1 EA program and you're a tier 4 EA program. That's your goal right there. That can't happen. If you can do whatever you can do to avoid Iowa fans being able to send memes to Nebraska to show that they're the lowest level of whatever. I don't play video games, so I don't know. It doesn't look good. I know that much. Tier 4 to tier 1 is not good. No, I think he can get it done. I made predictions under Scott Frost that didn't come true, and so now I'm like, well, I don't know. It comes down to how good Dylan Rhule is. I feel bad. Is he 18? Is he 19 yet? I don't know. I mean, so much is on his shoulders. Now, they're big shoulders. He's a big guy. You see him in person, bigger than he looks on TV. But he's got the world. He is Atlas, man. He has so much that he has to do to take this program. And that's why he's here. Like, you listen to him talk. He's here to bring Nebraska back. Like when his dad played and when people before him played, that's what his job is to bring them back. And I'm glad that's his motivation. But, man, that's a lot of work to get this program over the hump from a place that they've been with turnovers and special teams play and poor quarterback play and whatever else. Do I think it's going to happen? If I had to bet on it, I probably would. I'd bet on at least what Brandon said, a double-digit season. He's gotten in most places he's been. I could see him getting a double-digit win season. The question is, what happens after that and maintaining in a conference that is filled with so many damn teams, so many damn blue bloods. The good news is you'll have a year like this every now and then where you're playing, what are they playing, 4 of the bottom 5 teams in the conference this year. So you're going to get that happening. And that's when you have to make it happen, when you get the opportunity with the schedule.
Yep.
Are you saying that Dylan Rhule is the one who will bring balance to the force?
Well, it's funny about that is that we thought we knew who was going to bring balance to the force, and we were wrong.
Exactly.
We were.
Exactly.
So I don't know, man. I'd like to test his level of metachlorians first, and then we'll figure it out.
Michael, are you saying Scott Frost actually turned out to be Darth Vader? Is that what you're implying?
Well, if in about
you're the chosen one,
in about 20 years, all of a sudden he comes back without the helmet on, I don't know, maybe. But at this point, no. At this point, no. He's just he's one of those guys that got taken out in Order 66. That's who he is.
There we go.
The Star Wars references are just abundant in this chat right now. And I'm here for it. I am here for it.
Well, That wraps up the Reckoning series, Common fans. Thank you so much for hanging with us for this entire series of episodes. I hope it provided some good, thought-provoking, intriguing, interesting conversation for you and a trip down memory lane as we all sweat through the summer and start hankering for football season. So stick with the Common fans with football season right around the corner, fall camp right around the corner. We are just getting started. As you can tell, there's a lot of optimism about the 2024 season to come. So as always, Common fans, until next time, GBR for life.